Hi friends, welcome back to our art project, Repeated Sweets. This is lesson 3 of 4 lessons. Remember, with all of these projects in Art Class 2, there are 4 lessons and you need to watch them in sequence as you work along with me or work after the DVD is off. So watch 1 and 2 and then this is lesson 3. Okay, so what do we need for today's lesson? Well, you're going to need what you left off with in lesson 2. You should have your repeated sweets, but it's a flat wash that's nice and dry. You'll need a bowl of water, a waxy paper plate with a white center, some paper towels to help with cleaning your brushes, a pan of watercolors, at least 8, I have 16 with my set, and a few different brushes that are nice and soft and round, some smaller ones and some medium to larger ones. You'll need an extra piece of 11 by 14 paper and a pencil and eraser. Okay, we've been talking about Wayne Thiebaud, one of the legendary American pop artists. And what I love about Wayne Thiebaud is he makes you want to look at his paintings for a long time and notice every detail. And he was known for doing pop art that was very bright and colorful and had a lot of repetition, and his subject matter was very often treats, and that's what we're working on now. And so I'm really excited to get going a little further on. I want to teach you a new technique that we didn't go over last time. Last time we talked about a flat wash, and you'll see that's where the color really is just one even tone. Well, what if you wanted to make a gradually changing tone? This is often used when you're working with, say, painting a sky. So look up here at my sample. You'll see this is what's called a graded wash, which means it starts off darker at one edge and becomes lighter. Now, artists could do it from left to right, top to bottom, depending on what it is that they're actually painting. So for our purposes, a graded wash where the color gradually changes from darker to lighter is kind of tricky, so we need to practice first. So the first thing we're going to do is take your extra piece of paper and you're going to draw 2 squares. Now these don't need to be perfect squares, they're just for doing our little practice of a graded wash. So side by side here, but with space in between, I want you to draw like so, kind of like windows. And that's just going to give us where we're going to work with our graded wash. Now, just like with our flat wash, we start off with a little puddle, but makes this as just a little tinier puddle. There we go, on your paper plate. Take the largest brush that you have. I'm going to use this nice soft brush. I want you to kind of pull on it a little bit, see if you can get out any extra hairs. And we're going to wet the brush. And the first thing we're going to do is decide on what the color is of our graded wash. Now, I don't want it to be the same as this in my final, but I know that a graded wash is better if you choose a darker color. So I'm going to test 2 different colors on my sample here to see what I want to use on my final. I'm going to start with blue. And so just like we learned last time, friends, you want to load the brush. You never take the brush and stab it down into the paint. That ruins the brush. You keep the brush on its side and you roll it so that the pigment goes into the brush. Now I'm going to go straight to my paper. I'm not going to my puddle. I'm going to go straight to my paper to get the darkest possible color. And I'm going to go right across the top like a stripe. Like so. Now I'm going to go into my puddle, tap it. I want the pigment to offload just a little bit. And then I'm going to go right back over here and overlapping another line. Now I see I have a lot of water, so I'll make another mark to drag that down. Now back to my puddle. See, I want to see how much paint I'm offloading. Tap it. Make another mark. You can see it. I have a lot of water. It's getting lighter. I'm overlapping these kind of stripe marks I'm making. Back to my puddle. Tap out my brush. Overlap exactly where I just was. I'm dragging the pigment down. Kind of make 2 stripes going across. Tap in my puddle, tap off my brush, overlap exactly where I just was, Now a hair got in there, so I'm going to take one of my dry brushes that's standing by and use that to pick up the hair. There we go. Go back into my puddle. By now it's very diluted, mostly water, to make my last mark. You can see how it's darker at the top and gradually got lighter. Now, one option is to take some paper towel, tear off. If this is too much water, too much pigment, you can use your paper towel as a tool, kind of like an eraser, and you can blot up along that bottom to get it much, much lighter. Can you see that? Can you see how the paper towel picked up those puddles on the side? So now the very bottom of my square can be much lighter than the top where it's nice and dark. The whole idea, friends, is to not make it look like it's stripes, but so it's gradually getting lighter, which is why it's called a graded wash. It's graded, meaning it changes from the top to the bottom. All right, now I want to do a different color. I want to see, maybe I don't want to use that blue. I can't just go right into another color. It's really important, friends, that you don't mix on your watercolor pans or on your palette. So I want to clean my brush. I'm going to go into my bowl of water that's nice and clean, swish it around, and I'm going to go to my paper towel. Oh, look at all that blue that came out on the paper towel. That tells me I still have a lot of pigment in that brush. So I'm swirling it around in my clean water. Up, still see blue. I'm going to keep on going until when I stroke the paper towel, the brush runs clean. This is why it's important to take your time when you're working with watercolor. A little bit more. There we go. Now the water's running clean. Now, I don't want to use this puddle because I'm going to use a new color. So I need a new paper plate. Or, this is what you can do. You can dump your puddle into your bowl, take a section of paper towel, and wipe it clean. You don't want to waste a lot of supplies. And now this paper plate, since it was waxy coated, it didn't absorb any of that. It just was repelled the water on there. And you're ready to use it again. So now I want to start a new color. Okay? So before I create my puddle for my new color for my sample graded wash, I need some clean water. You probably have a sink handy where you are. I happen to have some extra water right here. Some clean water. So I'm going to pour a little puddle in my paper plate. And, I think I'm going to try, let's do red. So again, I'm going to load my brush by turning it while it's on its side. It's not a super wet brush, but it was a wet brush. And I'm turning it on its side several times to load the brush. That means I'm pulling pigment or color onto the brush. And I'm going to go straight to my square. That's not quite as dark as I want. I'm going to go load my brush and do it again. I'm going to make a couple of layers or stripes. But now, dip in my puddle just a little bit, tap off my brush, and drag another stripe across. Dip in my puddle to offload some pigment, tap my brush. And you can see it's gradually getting lighter. I want to get rid of some more pigment, tap that off so it's mostly water. Can you see it, friends, getting lighter? So that by the time I get to the bottom of the square, it's very pale. Now you might know this because you're a science kind of kid, but water loves other water, and so it will always bunch up together. And that's why there's these puddles that are created. Now that's actually kind of the fun part about watercolors. You never really know what kind of effect you're going to get. It's not flat like house paint. And so some people like that puddle. But remember what I said about being able to tear off a piece of your paper towel to use as an eraser if you don't like where things are bleeding out or puddling up. You can use a paper towel, and this is only while the paint is still really wet, to lighten. You see that technique? I'm using the paper towel as like an eraser. And if I want it to be even more gradual, I go back in with my brush very lightly to make it gradually from dark to light. So that's graded wash. It goes from dark to light. It can make some great effects when you're trying to paint a landscape with a sky with a graded wash. So I think I like the intense color of the blue, and that's probably what I'm going to do on my final cupcake. So now it's time to do our graded wash. Now make sure, my friends, that you have some newsprint or newspaper underneath where you're working, because we're going to go right off the sides. We're not going to worry about being careful. Go right off the sides. I mean, you want something that's going to protect the surface that you're working on. Okay? So I have to clean my brush. Always clean your brush in between. While you're cleaning your brushes and getting ready to do your real graded wash, let me show you one of T-Bow's work. This is T-Bow's pie slices. We looked at it in lesson 1. And you'll notice there's lemon, chocolate. On the very top shelf there's some apple, some pumpkin. And on the third shelf it looks like cherry pie. They all look really yummy. The idea is that they were all just a little different. Same, but different. Now look at gumball machines. Same machine, exact same machine, but the arrangement of the gumballs within each globe is different. Back to your treat. Will your treat have different frosting on it, different decorations, different color, different flavor? As an artist, you get to choose. That's the fun part. I'm going to work on my graded wash, and that will be nice and out of the way of the cupcakes, because with watercolor paint, remember we talked about that you can't have wet paint up against wet paint because it'll bleed together. And so we're going to do the graded wash, let it dry as we prepare to do the rest of ours. Okay, so I'm going to dump this into this water, take some paper towel to clean my palette, and I'll use a clean puddle to do my graded wash. There we go. Now remember, you always work quickly. I have a big surface. This isn't a tiny square. This is pretty wide. So I'm going to have to work pretty quickly across, because I want to make sure that when I'm making my layers, the stripes of my graded wash, that it's wet on wet. I want it to bleed so that it gets that nice graded look. So first I'm going to dip my brush in the water. I've decided I'm using kind of this nice deep intense blue. So I put my brush on the side and I'm loading my brush, and I'm ready to get my darkest one. I'm just going right across. You notice I was even right off the page. And I want to work quickly. Dip in my puddle. Back again, dip in my puddle. I'm making my brush wetter each time I go, which means it's going to be lighter or paler, so that by the time I get down to the bottom of this, it's much paler. Darker at the top. Now, if you've done your graded wash along with me, if your drawing even has room for a graded wash, I would like it to be darker at the top. And while the paint is still wet, this is perfect. I'm going to go right into my pan, load my brush, and make the darker mark at the top. And I can repeat the process till I get the kind of gradation I want. Now we don't want it to look stripy, right? You're not going very slow. You're moving quickly. And that's on purpose so that you have nice wet paint in with wet paint. And when I'm down here by my flat wash, I want it to be even lighter. So I'm going to take some paper towel here, and use it as an eraser. So it's nice and light. Can only do this when it's wet, my friends. You can only do it when the paint is wet. This is a great technique for when you're trying to do a sky. You just fill in with a graded wash of blue, and then you take a chunk of paper towel like this, and you blot out for where your clouds are. Isn't that cool? So I'm tapping off my brush. I just want to do a couple little quick marks. Now, another rule of watercolors. The longer you linger with a lot of water over something like board or paper, it's going to cause your paper to wave. Now, there's special watercolor paper that you can get, and that's meant to take watercolor, but it can be kind of pricey. Sometimes I like to work on just board like this, and sometimes I like to do longer projects where I know I'm going to be putting on a lot of layers of paint, where then I need to make sure it stays nice and flat. Has it ever happened to you where you pick up a newspaper after it's been wet and it's kind of wavy? And that's because the fibers in the paper are breaking down and getting soft, and that's why it starts to wave, and this is what happens. That's why it's also important to let your artwork dry nice and flat. You don't hang it up until it's perfectly dry and really flat, and you leave it that way for a long time. Okay, so now that we've done our graded wash, we're ready to move on, and we never do wet paint against wet paint, which means we have to work down here. But I want to keep it still, let it dry, and I'm going to work on some flat areas of our main motif. So I'm going to actually clean off this brush. It's kind of big. I'm not going to use it for these smaller areas. I'm going to use a smaller brush. So I'm going to move to my medium round brush, but I still want to make sure that this brush is clean. So I keep dipping in the water and stroking on the paper towel. Another way you can do it, friends, save yourself some time, is to actually embrace it or sandwich it in the paper towel, squeeze out the water, and then you can kind of get both sides of the brush, and then you'll really be able to tell if there's still pigment on your brush. That's pretty good. So now I'm going to move to a medium-sized brush. A nice soft bristles, and it kind of comes to a point. If you pull at it and it's a little wet, you can see that it can come to a point. That's called a round brush. So on a separate part of my palette, I'm going to have available if I need it. But when we're doing this kind of area, we're not doing the detail yet, but we're doing the main color, you can usually do it without using a puddle. So make a decision. What's going to be the same in your painting? I'm going to make the cupcake holders, that fluted paper that holds the batter. I'm going to make those exactly the same. Other things I'm going to change. But you decide what's going to be the same, because we're going to work first at one, then the other quickly to get the base layer. So I'm going to make the cups that hold the cupcake batter kind of a orange color. So I dip my brush, and then I load my brush, right, by twirling it around. And I'm going to dip my brush again. And I'll explain why in a second, because now it's really wet. Because I don't want it to be too dark down here. I want it to be fairly light. Or pale. Have you heard that word, pale? Now I want to make sure it's the same for all three. That's kind of pale, pale orange. Pale is kind of like light. And this is just our first layer of color. And I'm able to do it against this purple because that purple is perfectly dry. But I am careful. I don't want to go out into the purple too much. Dip my brush, load a little bit, come right over here. That's a little dark. I want to add some more water. Pale paint. We're going to get darker later. So notice how quickly I just went boom, boom, boom. 1, 2, 3. Do they look the same to you? I want them to look the same. This one could probably be a little darker. There we go. Still pretty pale though, right? So I have my 3 areas that are going to be exactly the same. And I'm not really putting in a lot of detail. I'm just filling in the basic color. Great. Well, I'm ready to move on to another section, but I know I can't have wet next to wet, which means I can't do that batter. You know, the batter that spills up when they bake up over the cup. I love that. I can't do that because that's right against the cup. So I'm going to have to work on the frosting because it's away. So I think for that, I'm going to do 3 different colors. That's where it's going to be different. So I know I want one to be chocolate, so that will be brown. So let's just do that first. So I'm going to clean my brush by dipping and squeezing in the paper towel. Good. Now wet your brush and roll in your first color. So this is brown, and I'm loading my brush by turning it to the side. And quickly fill in just that area. Now be careful, right? We don't want wet paint to go near wet paint. And see, I can use the tip of my brush. You can be careful if you have a very light hand. Just use the tip of your brush to drag that paint. I don't know. I like darker chocolate. So go back into your pan. Great. Shouldn't take you too long. Now what if you're doing something like, say, a chocolate-coated popsicle? All 3 of those will have brown, right? And then maybe, where can you have your variety? Where can you make it different? Maybe in the ice cream that's inside, if you show a bite taken out, then you can have different ice cream inside. If you're doing donuts, the icing on the donuts can be, one could be chocolate, one could be strawberry, and one could be something else. So now I'm ready to move on to the next color. Yeah, I don't see any green in here, so let's do like pistachio green. Have you ever had pistachio icing? All right. Swirl my brush, clean it off on the paper towel till I see no more color coming out, and I don't, so that's good. Wet my brush, and I'm going to go with this, this really bright green here. Load my brush by turning it on its side over and over. Great. And now, just using the tip, don't press real hard, your brush shouldn't be flat. I will fill in this frosting area here. Perfect. Great. And you know, it's going to puddle in little spots. That's what watercolor does, and that's what makes watercolors unique. So don't stress about that, my friends. Watercolors are meant to feel very loose and free. Perfect. I don't really like strawberry, but I like orange and I like cherry and some other flavor. I'm trying to think, maybe something like blueberry. So I want to do this. I don't want to use purple, I've used it here. I don't want to use orange, I've used it here, but I really want some variety. I want color that's going to pop. I could do yellow, I suppose, but this green is kind of light. I bet you there's a type of frosting that's boysenberry, like a bright, intense pinky purple. So that's what I'm going to do. As the artist, you get to make the decisions. So don't forget to wash and clean your brush before you move on to a new color. So dip your brush, and this color looks great. Look at that. That looks like a berry of some kind. So I'm going to load my brush, turning it on its side, and then go right into, oh, that's great, right into this area. Perfect. Now it's important that you remember what pans you used, what colors, because we are going to come back to this in lesson 4 to put in some shading, and you have to know what pan you used. Okay, so here's this kind of berry color here. That's great. Yum! Well, I'm kind of stuck. I can't really do the cherry because that's right against the frosting and that'll bleed. And I can't really do the cake batter because that'll bleed. So that tells me that this is as far as I can go for this lesson with these pale colors, because I don't want to mess it up and have the colors bleed, and I need to wait till they dry. And this is how it is when you're working with watercolors. You do it in stages so that when you want colors to stay static, you don't want them to blend or mix, that you need them to dry really well before you move on. But that's okay, because we're going to put in our details and our shade and shadow in lesson 4. Right now we have these pale tones, and that's just fine. Do you know what pale means? Pale is when the color is drained out of something. Have you ever heard that expression of someone going pale, where the color in their face is gone? There's a great story in the Bible. I bet you've heard of it. It's in the book of Daniel. Daniel was a young boy when he was captured, he and his friends. Israel had been taken over by Babylon. And so he was taken away, and it was really sad. All these young men that were vibrant, but Babylon was really worried that these young Israeli men would really cause a lot of damage and rise up and be soldiers. And so they captured them and they took them back as slaves. Well, he was captured by King Nebuchadnezzar, but the story that I'm going to tell you is about Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, and he was a nasty guy. So what happened was Daniel still worked there. He was known as a really great servant and great slave, but Belshazzar was a really proud king and not very nice. And so our story is from Daniel 5, when Belshazzar, the king at that time, was having a feast. And at this feast he had all the nobles and princes from there. And they were drinking and eating and partying and having a great time. And Belshazzar asked for all the sacred vessels that had come from God's temple to be brought out, and he was going to use them in a way that God never intended, to just fill with wine and drink out of. They were meant to be used in the temple for sacred ceremonies. And instead, Belshazzar used those sacred vessels that he had robbed from God's temple back in Israel, and he started to praise the gods of gold and silver and wood and iron using those sacred vessels. So here's what happened. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. Wow, has that ever happened to you? You actually got so frightened over something that you started to shake and you could hear your knees knocking together? There's a famous painting about Belshazzar's feast by the Dutch artist Rembrandt. Take a look at it. It's really compelling as I finish the rest of the story. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to those wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing on the wall or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. But there's more to the story. In verse 10 we read, "The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came running into the banquet hall. 'May the king live forever,' she said. 'Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy God in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief over all the magicians, enchanters, and astrologers. And he did this because Daniel was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve really difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what it means." And my friends, that is exactly what happened. Daniel, who was an older man by now, he was able to tell the king the 3 words that were written by that mysterious hand on the wall, because God had revealed it to Daniel's mind. Daniel didn't want the robe or the gold chain. He didn't want any of those prizes, but he did read very carefully what it meant to King Belshazzar. "Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and will be given over to the Medes and the Persians. Whoa, Belshazzar didn't want to hear that. God found him wanting, he wasn't a very good man, and that this kingdom that he'd worked so long for, carried on from his father, was going to be divided up between his enemies. But do you know that very night Belshazzar was killed? We don't know how, it doesn't say in the Bible. But Darius the Mede then took over the reign. It's exactly as Daniel had prophesied, exactly what was written on the wall. No wonder Belshazzar went pale. He was really frightened. Well, it's a great story from the Bible. I just wanted to show you that pale is used in art, pale colors, or when the color drains out of your face from fear. That's why he was pale. Now we need to let this dry, and the next time we're together we're going to be putting in a whole lot of detail so that these look really real and really yummy. I'm sure they look yummy already back at home where you are. So I'll see you next time for Lesson 4.